Here's a question no one ever asks. Why did the Supreme Commander of Allied Forces, the man responsible for the largest military invasion in human history, carry a gun designed for plainclothes detectives? Think about it. Every American general in World War II had access to the legendary M1911. 45 caliber, 7 rounds of pure stopping power. The gun that won 2 world wars. The gun that said, "I'm a warrior. I'm ready to fight." Patton carried one. So did Bradley, so did MacArthur, but not Eisenhower. Dwight David Eisenhower, the man who planned D-Day, who commanded 3 million soldiers, who would become the 34th President of the United States, chose something else. A snub-nose revolver. A Colt Detective Special. The same gun carried by FBI agents working undercover. By private investigators tailing cheating husbands. By cops who needed a weapon that could disappear into a coat pocket and never be seen. A gun designed to be invisible. And here's the strangest part. His staff didn't know. Not his aides, not his driver, not the generals who sat across from him in planning meetings. Eisenhower kept this gun concealed inside his trousers, held in place by a homemade clip. He fashioned himself from a mess kit. No fancy holster, no military issue, just a piece of bent metal and a pocket full of secrets. Why? Why would the most powerful American general in Europe, a man surrounded by bodyguards, protected by entire divisions of troops, feel the need to carry a hidden weapon that no one knew about? The answer takes us to Christmas Eve 1944, to a plot hatched by Hitler's most dangerous commando, to a moment when Eisenhower realized that all the tanks and planes and soldiers in the world couldn't protect him from a single assassin, with the right disguise and the right opportunity. This is the story they don't teach in history class. The story of a general who projected calm to the world, while secretly preparing for the worst. The story of why America's greatest military commander trusted a detective's gun more than a soldier's. To understand why Eisenhower chose the weapon he did, you first have to understand who Eisenhower was and who he wasn't. Dwight David Eisenhower graduated from West Point in 1915. His class would later be called the class the stars fell on. 59 of its graduates would eventually become generals. Eisenhower ranked 61st out of 164 cadets academically, and 125th in discipline. He was no academic star, no model soldier. What he was, even then, was a leader of men. But here's the thing that set Eisenhower apart from almost every other 5-star general. In American history, he never saw a single day of combat, not one. In 35 years of military service, Dwight Eisenhower never fired a weapon at an enemy, never dodged incoming fire, never felt the ground shake beneath him from artillery shells. When the United States entered World War I, young Lieutenant Eisenhower desperately wanted to go to France. He requested deployment orders 3 separate times. Each time the army refused. His superiors saw something valuable in him, something more important than another body in the trenches. Eisenhower could organize. He could train. He could turn raw recruits into soldiers, faster than officers who had actually seen combat. So they kept him stateside. In 1918, the Army sent him to establish Camp Colt near Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, the first American training facility for the Tank Corps. Without actual tanks, because the Army didn't have any to spare, Eisenhower improvised. He mounted machine guns on flatbed trucks and led simulated armored assaults. He commanded and trained over 10,000 men. He earned the Distinguished Service Medal. And then came the cruelest turn of his military career. On October 14, 1918, his 28th birthday, Eisenhower received orders to deploy to France. He would finally command an armored unit in combat. The departure date was set for November 18th. But on November 11th, the armistice was signed. The war ended 7 days before he could ship out. Eisenhower was devastated. For the next 2 decades, he served in staff positions. Panama, the Philippines, Washington. He worked for Douglas MacArthur, writing the general's reports. He graduated first in his class from the Army War College. He spent a year studying the battlefields of France, the very battlefields he'd never fought on. When Pearl Harbor was attacked on December 7, 1941, Eisenhower was a brigadier general and chief of staff of the Third Army in Texas. 5 days later, Army Chief of Staff George Marshall summoned him to Washington. The Philippines was in crisis. Marshall needed an officer who knew the region. What happened next defied all military logic. Within 8 months, Eisenhower went from lieutenant colonel to 3-star general. In June 1942, Marshall chose him to command all U.S. forces in Europe. Over 366 more senior officers. Most of those officers had served with distinction in the trenches of France. Most had combat experience. Most had proven themselves under fire. Eisenhower had none of that. And yet Marshall chose him anyway. Why? Because Marshall understood something that would define the Second World War. This war wouldn't be won by individual heroics. It would be won by logistics, by strategy, by the ability to coordinate massive operations across nations and continents, and to work with Allied commanders who distrusted each other. Eisenhower was the perfect man for that job. But being the perfect man for the job didn't mean everyone believed in him. British Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery openly expressed disdain for Eisenhower. He felt Ike's generalship was second-rate. George Patton, Eisenhower's friend since 1919, privately referred to him as Britain's straw man. He thought Ike was too weak to face the coming storm. These criticisms cut deep. Eisenhower knew what men said behind his back. The desk general, the office man, the commander who had never heard a shot fired in anger. He couldn't change his past, but he could prepare for his future. And that future, he suspected, might require him to defend himself in ways that no bodyguard could. In 1927, a Colt employee named John Henry Fitzgerald had an idea. Fitzgerald was a legendary figure in the firearms world, a shooting instructor, exhibition shooter and self-defense expert, who worked for Colt from 1918 to 1944. He understood something that most gun designers of his era did not. Sometimes the most important thing about a weapon isn't how much damage it can do. It's whether anyone knows you have it. Fitzgerald took the Colt Police Positive Special, a standard police revolver, and modified it. He shortened the barrel to just 2 inches. He shortened the ejector rod. He rounded off the grip frame. And most controversially, he cut away the front of the trigger guard entirely, allowing faster trigger acquisition. He called his creation the Fitz Special. Colt's executives were so impressed that they decided to produce their own version. Slightly less radical, but built on the same principle. They called it the Detective Special. The name told you everything you needed to know about who this gun was for. Not uniformed officers, not soldiers on a battlefield. This gun was designed for men who needed to blend in. Plainclothes detectives, undercover agents, men who carried their weapons hidden beneath a jacket or tucked into a trouser pocket. The Detective Special was chambered in .38 Special, a powerful cartridge for a concealed weapon, and held 6 rounds in a swing-out cylinder. It weighed just 21 ounces unloaded. The 2-inch barrel made it easy to conceal, and the rounded grip prevented it from printing through clothing. It was, in the words of one firearms expert, the gold standard in small defensive revolvers. For decades, the Detective Special was the weapon of choice for FBI agents working undercover, for off-duty police officers who needed a backup gun, for bodyguards who wanted something they could reach quickly, without anyone knowing they were armed. And during World War II, the U.S. Army quietly acquired roughly 5,000 Detective Specials. Nearly 3,000 of them went to the Office of Strategic Services, the OSS. The OSS was America's wartime intelligence agency, the predecessor to the CIA. Its operatives worked behind enemy lines. They gathered intelligence. They ran sabotage operations. They assassinated Nazi officials. These were men and women who needed weapons that could disappear. The Detective Special was perfect. But the OSS wasn't the only organization that recognized the value of a concealed weapon. Somewhere in the chaos of the European theater, a Detective Special found its way into the hands of the Supreme Allied Commander, and he kept it a secret. To understand Eisenhower's choice, you have to understand what guns American generals typically carried and what those guns meant. In 1944, the U.S. Army established the General Officers Pistol Program. The idea was simple. Generals deserved a more elegant sidearm than the standard-issue M1911. So the Army began issuing compact pistols, Colt M1903s in .32 caliber and M1908s in .380, to its highest-ranking officers. These were beautiful weapons, sleek, polished, engraved, and largely useless for actual combat. Most generals understood this. The general officer's pistol was what military men called a social weapon, something you wore to show your rank, not something you expected to use. Many generals purchased the pistols upon retirement as keepsakes, but when it came to actual self-defense, most senior officers relied on what they'd always relied on, the M1911. George Patton was famous for his ivory-handled revolvers, but he also carried an M1911. He believed that a commanding officer should always be armed and ready to fight. Omar Bradley carried an M1911. Douglas MacArthur carried an M1911. The M1911 was the American military sidearm. It had been since 1911. It represented power, authority, and the willingness to personally engage the enemy. Eisenhower had access to all of these weapons. Before Operation Torch, the Allied invasion of North Africa, in November 1942, Eisenhower gave his personal Colt M1911A1 to British Admiral Andrew Cunningham as a gift. It was a gesture of friendship and alliance. He also possessed a general officer's pistol, one of those elegant .380 caliber Colts that were more symbol than weapon. But neither of these was the gun he chose to carry close to his body. Instead, Eisenhower concealed a .38 Detective Special inside his trousers, held in place by a clip he'd fashioned himself from a mess kit. No fancy holster, no military issue, no one knew. Why? Because Eisenhower understood something that Patton and MacArthur did not. Patton led from the front lines. He wanted his men to see him armed, to see him ready to fight alongside them. His weapons were symbols of his warrior spirit. Eisenhower led from headquarters. His job was not to inspire individual soldiers, but to coordinate entire armies. His power came not from personal bravery, but from strategic vision. And strategic vision meant preparing for threats that no one else was thinking about. Patton worried about German tanks. Eisenhower worried about German assassins. The M1911 was a soldier's weapon. Big, loud, obvious. Everyone could see it on your hip. It announced your readiness to fight. The Detective Special was something else entirely. It was a survivor's weapon, a weapon for the moment when the bodyguards had failed, and you were on your own. You didn't carry a Detective Special because you expected trouble. You carried it because you knew trouble had a way of finding you. When you least expected it, on September 12, 1943, a German glider landed on a rocky plateau high in the mountains of central Italy. Inside were 12 German commandos, led by a 6'4" Austrian, with a scar running down the left side of his face. His name was Otto Skorzeny, and he was about to become the most famous special operations soldier in the world. Skorzeny and his men had come to rescue Benito Mussolini. The Italian dictator had been deposed 2 months earlier and was being held prisoner at the Campo Imperatore Hotel, a ski resort at the top of Gran Sasso, the highest peak in the Apennine Mountains. The hotel was accessible only by cable car, and Italian guards had been ordered to kill Mussolini if any rescue attempt was made. The mission seemed impossible. Skorzeny made it look easy. His commandos overwhelmed the guards without firing a shot. Within minutes, Mussolini was free. Skorzeny crammed the overweight dictator into a tiny Fiesler Storch aircraft and flew him to safety. Adolf Hitler was ecstatic. He personally decorated Skorzeny with the Knight's Cross of the Iron Cross and promoted him to major. The German propaganda machine turned Scarface into a celebrity, the daring commando who could accomplish any mission. But Skorzeny was just getting started. In October 1944, he kidnapped the son of Hungarian regent Miklos Horthy, wrapping him in a carpet and throwing him into a truck. The kidnapping forced Horthy to resign, keeping Hungary in the war on Germany's side. He attempted to capture Yugoslav partisan leader Josip Tito, missing him by mere hours. And then in December 1944, Hitler gave Skorzeny his most ambitious mission yet, Operation Greif. The plan was audacious. Germany was launching a massive counter-offensive through the Ardennes forest, what would become known as the Battle of the Bulge. Skorzeny would lead a special brigade of English-speaking German soldiers, dressed in American uniforms and driving captured American vehicles, to seize key bridges over the Meuse River. But that wasn't all. Skorzeny also assembled a smaller group, approximately 44 commandos, with perfect American English, who would infiltrate Allied lines and cause chaos. They would spread false rumors, misdirect troops, cut communication lines, and, according to some reports, assassinate Allied commanders, including Dwight Eisenhower. The German commandos began crossing into Allied territory on December 16, 1944. Some were caught almost immediately. Under interrogation, some say under torture, they revealed the details of Operation Greif, including the assassination plot. The captured Germans claimed that Skorzeny himself was leading a team to Paris. Their target, the Supreme Allied Commander. Allied intelligence went into a frenzy. Within hours, every American command post in Europe had received the warning. Nazi assassins dressed as Americans were hunting Eisenhower. Now here's where history gets murky. Skorzeny later claimed that the assassination plot was a lie, deliberate disinformation spread by his captured men to cause maximum chaos. He said his real mission was only to capture bridges, not to kill Eisenhower. Some historians believe him. They point out that Operation Greif was already ambitious enough without adding an assassination to the mix, and that spreading false rumors would have been a clever way to multiply the operation's psychological impact. Others aren't so sure. They note that the Germans had attempted to assassinate Allied leaders before, and that Hitler had every reason to want Eisenhower dead. The truth may never be known. But in December 1944, the truth didn't matter. What mattered was what the Allies believed, and they believed that Otto Skorzeny, the man who had rescued Mussolini from an impregnable fortress, was coming for Eisenhower. Christmas Eve 1944. Paris had been liberated for 4 months, but the city felt like it was under siege. German troops had smashed through Allied lines in the Ardennes, creating a bulge 50 miles deep into territory that had been secure. Just days before, American units were being surrounded and destroyed. The 101st Airborne was trapped in Bastogne with no hope of relief. For the first time since D-Day, the outcome of the war in Europe seemed uncertain. And somewhere in the chaos, Nazi assassins were hunting the Supreme Allied Commander. At SHAEF headquarters, the Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force, security officers had transformed the building into a fortress. Tanks ringed the perimeter. Machine gun nests covered every approach. Barbed wire blocked the streets. Inside, Dwight Eisenhower was, in his own words, practically a prisoner. His driver, Kay Summersby, would later recall the chaos of those days. Armed guards followed Eisenhower everywhere. His route to work changed daily, sometimes hourly. Car backfires sent security teams into a panic. Gunfire echoed through the streets as nervous sentries challenged anyone who looked suspicious. Eisenhower hated every minute of it. He was not a man who liked being protected. He believed that a commanding general should be visible, accessible, able to move freely among his troops. Being trapped in headquarters while his men fought and died in the frozen forests of Belgium felt like a personal failure. But the security measures weren't paranoid. They were necessary because the threat was real. Throughout the Ardennes, German commandos in American uniforms were spreading chaos. They changed road signs. They gave false orders. They cut telephone lines. They murdered American soldiers and stole their dog tags. The psychological effect was devastating. Suddenly, no one could trust anyone. Every American soldier became a potential German spy. Checkpoints sprouted at every crossroad, and the challenges became increasingly bizarre. Who won the World Series in 1943? What's the capital of Illinois? Who is Mickey Mouse's girlfriend? American soldiers who couldn't answer these questions were detained, sometimes for hours, sometimes at gunpoint. In the confusion, several actual American soldiers were shot by their own side. General Omar Bradley was stopped at a checkpoint and asked to identify Betty Grayble's husband. He gave the wrong answer and was held until a colonel who knew him could vouch for his identity. Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery was stopped and nearly refused passage. He threatened to have the MPs court-martialed. General Bruce Clark was detained for 5 hours. After he correctly stated that the Chicago Cubs played in the National League, the MP thought they were American League. If German commandos could cause this much chaos, what chance did security officers have of stopping a targeted assassination? In his headquarters, Eisenhower chain-smoked and paced. His famous temper flared at anyone who suggested he stay hidden. He wanted to visit the front lines, to see his commanders, to take control of the situation. His security officers refused. For 3 days, the supreme Allied commander of the largest military force in history was effectively imprisoned by the threat of a single man. Otto Skorzeny never came to Paris. The assassination plot, if it ever existed, was never carried out. But the experience changed Eisenhower. He had learned something about the limits of protection. No matter how many tanks surrounded you, no matter how many guards watched your door, there would always be a moment when you were alone. A moment when no one could help you. And for that moment, Eisenhower decided he would be ready. After the Battle of the Bulge, Eisenhower returned to his duties. He commanded the final push into Germany. He accepted the German surrender on May 7, 1945. He became a 5-star general of the army, one of only 9 men in American history to hold that rank. And through it all, he kept his secret. The Colt Detective Special stayed with him. Not as an official sidearm, not as a symbol of rank, but as something more personal, a lesson learned. You see, Eisenhower understood what most generals did not. Patton could charge into battle with his ivory-handled revolvers, because Patton was a combat commander. He lived on the front lines. His enemies wore German uniforms and drove German tanks. They were obvious. Eisenhower's enemies were different. His enemies might wear American uniforms. They might speak perfect English. They might walk right past his guards with forged papers and friendly smiles. Against that kind of enemy, the M1911 on your hip meant nothing. Against that kind of enemy, you needed a weapon no one knew about. A weapon you could reach when everything else had failed. A weapon designed not for war but for survival. The Detective Special was that weapon. It was the gun of undercover agents and plainclothes detectives. Men who operated in a world where the enemy could be anyone. Where you couldn't count on backup. Where the only person you could truly rely on was yourself. And that, in the end, was what Eisenhower had learned in those terrible days of December 1944. He was the Supreme Allied Commander. He had millions of men under his command. He had tanks and planes and artillery at his disposal. But none of that mattered if a single assassin got close enough. The Detective Special was his insurance policy. Not against armies, not against conventional threats, but against the one scenario that kept him awake at night. The scenario where his guards failed, where his security broke down, where he found himself face to face with someone who wanted him dead. In that moment, the .38 snub-nose revolver in his pocket would give him a chance. A small chance, but a chance. For a man who had spent his entire career preparing for every contingency, that was enough. Eisenhower left active duty in 1948. He served as president of Columbia University, then as the first Supreme Commander of NATO. In 1952, he was elected President of the United States. He served 2 terms, guiding America through the early Cold War. He built the interstate highway system. He sent federal troops to integrate schools in Little Rock. He warned the nation about the dangers of the military-industrial complex. And he never spoke publicly about the concealed revolver he had carried during the war. It was a secret he kept until the end. But the lesson of that revolver outlasted him. The lesson is this: leadership is not about appearing invincible. It's about being prepared. It's about understanding that there are threats no bodyguard can stop, dangers no security system can prevent. It's about having a plan, your own plan, for the moment when everything else fails. Eisenhower's critics called him a desk general. They said he didn't understand war because he'd never fought in one. They were wrong. Eisenhower understood war better than any of them. He understood that war is chaos, that plans fail, that the best-laid strategies dissolve the moment they contact the enemy. And he understood that in war, as in life, the only person you can truly count on is yourself. That's why he carried a detective's gun instead of a soldier's. Not because he was afraid, but because he was prepared. Dwight David Eisenhower, the Supreme Allied Commander who never fired a shot in combat, the 5-star general who trusted a 2-inch revolver more than all the armies in the world, the man who understood that sometimes the most powerful weapon is the one no one knows you have,